So for those who haven't seen this, we opened an issue that was kind of the condensing of a variety of thoughts around improvements to SIOP into kind of a laundry list per se of open kind of questions around what's required. So today I'm just going to quickly go through a few of the key issues, not all of them, and some thoughts that I've had, and kind of put them into context on various drafts that are swirling about aiming to improve SIOP. So first off, this issue's been discussed in a variety of ways. I tend to call it kind of claims bindings, which is the idea that you have claims providers or traditional OpenID Connect providers today, and then you have a component which is the SIOP in the center that can connect to these providers as a provider of claims, and then field requests through a site request and response. And essentially, the thing that is required to ensure integrity and the guarantees to the relying party are upheld, the SIOP response and the relying party essentially needs to be able to establish that the subject identifier used in the SIOP response and the claims being presented that the SIOP is presenting on behalf of the claims providers are suitably bound together. Put another way, essentially, because each of these OpenID providers are identity providers in their own sense, a user's obviously uniquely identified in those various contexts. When we have SIOP, we have a aggregation occurring where we are taking claims from multiple sources and we're presenting them through another provider. And so we need to make sure that the binding back to the original providers for the claims that are being presented are suitably bound, as the SIOP is in charge of the user identifier that the relying party is to rely upon, and therefore the thing the SIOP provider is really doing in reference to claims provided by other OPs is asserting that those claims are related to that subject that the relying party has authenticated. I see a question. What are you binding to? From Tony. Essentially, the binding is the subject identifier that the SIOP is in charge of returning as a unique identifier that the relying party relies upon for the subject. You're binding that you are establishing a way in which, so that the relying party can transparently understand that the claims that are being presented by the SIOP on behalf of an OP or another claims provider are suitably bound to that subject identifier. And for example, the SIOP has not taken an ID token from another internet transaction and is using those, trying to impersonate those claims or impersonate that subject. Does that answer your question, Tony?
Are you trying to bind it to the subject identifier?
Yes.
General, or just for this, or is it a transactional binding?
No, it's well, so I think, I mean, there's multiple ways you can do that, but it is the identifier that the SIOP is returning in the response is the identifier that the relying party relies upon. And so the claims that are being presented either need to be suitably bound to that identifier or to the transaction under which. They need to be able to establish that user ZYX has claims from 1, 2, and 3, and the integrity of that binding is upheld.
Okay, because I would divide this into like holder binding and holder verification. I assume you're not doing holder verification, which is the process of, authenticating the individual. Okay.
Yeah, no, so yeah.
So you're doing holder binding in this particular case.
Yeah, it's not token binding.
Yeah.
Kind of. It's making a relationship between the claims returned by the claims provider and PPID or ephemeral identifier that SIOP is using against this particular relying party at that particular point in time.
Yes. Well, I heard it was not in a particular point in time. I heard it's a permanent binding between that identifier.
Well, but then if that identifier is used only once, it's
Yeah,
one of those.
I'm just trying to fully understand what the proposal, that's all.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. So I mean, as per kind of, it depends. It comes to the discretion of the SIOP, because they obviously, under any identity provider, you could choose to have a second identifier in a new transaction. You just lose the ability to tap into any existing kind of context or session with that relying party.
Thank you, appreciate it.
So I think one of the desired behaviors around this claims binding is to, in many instances, prevent relying party tracking. So the SIOP uses pairwise subject identifiers with each relying party. So to relate to the diagram, the subject identifier SIOP uses with relying party 1, 2, and 3 can be different, but they can also present claims from different providers, and there isn't strong correlation triggered. And essentially, the current working to date is we've been working on an approach around client-bound assertions, which essentially enables the SIOP, when they fetch these claims, to go back and authenticate and ask for an assertion to be generated that lists the eventual identifier that will be sent in the response to the relying party through aggregated and distributed claims. And authenticate that to the claims provider to get that assertion. Sorry, so this is not a particular SIOP item, but could be general. Yes. So claims aggregation, which I believe Nat will talk about a little bit later, will probably touch similar on this issue in a similar way. One of the next items on the SIOP laundry list is a way to find the SIOP address. So essentially, when we say what we mean by this is, how does a relying party establish communication with a user's elected provider in order to conduct a OpenID Connect transaction? The current solution hinted about in the OpenID Connect core chapter 7 is that a custom URL scheme will be used, and SIOP providers will essentially register their intent to handle URLs of the scheme, and when a request is fired along this URL, that elected SIOP provider is invoked. And importantly, as opposed to some other approaches around how this sort of behavior can occur, this allows for things like native apps to be a self-issued OpenID provider. The unanswered questions around this approach for me at this stage is what happens when there are no applications registered to handle this scheme. Currently in a browser, there's no way to inquire about whether or not a protocol handler is registered within a browser. So that the behavior around that, and as Tim Capelli also raises, multiple apps also become problematic, because if a user wants to be able to switch between different providers, you can only have one prioritized scheme handler at once. Yeah, and getting the OpenID scheme registered by browsers so that it is reflected and recognized by the OS is also something of priority using this approach. The alternative solution that I believe Kim Cameron came up with, which I have some similar sort of questions around, which is registering the SIOP with the browser and have the browser advertise the support on an HTTP request to the relying party. And similar questions exist. I think the commonality between these two approaches is that both require some form of native browser support. It depends how large that support needs to be. between these two different approaches. A really interesting issue is around attesting keys from the past. So in general, when building systems that leverage cryptography, it's considered bad practice to not account for the need to rotate keys at some stage and encourage long-term behavior and reliance on a single set of cryptographic keys. And the problem we have at the moment is that the statements inside Chapter 7 of OpenID Connect Core mandate the relationship between the subject field being the thumbprint of the JWK and the current sub JWK value. And so in order to rotate this identifier, we would create instability around the subject identifier. So put another way, this here is an example SIOP response. And my interpretation of the spec today says this is the identifier that the relying party and that's fielding a SIOP response is going to rely upon to uniquely identify the subject. And rotating this value breaks the normative relationship between these two fields because this needs to be the thumbprint of this. And so my suggestion as a solution to this is to propose a breaking change around relaxing the constraint that forces the subject and subject JWK value to be coupled to one another. Instead, allow flexibility around the subfield and the key used to sign the subject JWK are related, and allow for the optional support of emerging technologies like decentralized identifiers that handle key rotation outside of OpenID. How that might look is something like this. So the relying party would need to advertise support for something like handling DID resolution, decentralized identifiers, in their request made to a SIOP provider. And then the key used to sign this response is reported in the KID of the response in the outer JWS, for which this is a JWS. And relying parties would then validate the keys membership in the DID document. And key rotation is handled for those who are unfamiliar with decentralized identifiers by that technology. How we would perhaps handle this without decentralized identifiers, essentially we need some way of communicating key rotation events. This is really just a draft proposal, and to what extent this would need to be defined within OpenID. A revision to SIOP is undecided, but essentially you could elect to prefix this with the URN so that it's clearer the format of the subject identifier. This would be the current JWK used to sign the response, and then some form of proof that would relate it back to the original JWK that was used to generate this thumbprint. Some other questions around the mandated usage of the self-issued.me in the issuer field of the SIOP response. Some thoughts that I have on this is that this is essentially used to inform the relying party that the response is that the ID token that a relying party is relying upon is in fact a SIOP response, and hence needs to conduct some additional response validation in order to correctly process it. But essentially at the moment, because the OpenID Connect, because the metadata is static for this OpenID Connect, it essentially infers and hardcodes the following kind of behavior around SIOP providers. And so in terms of a solution, I would like to potentially propose that we revise usage of this identifier and in place potentially have a URN or something else that indicates the response is SIOP based but removes the implication that the static OpenID metadata kind of enforces all OpenID providers to support RSA. Another point I'd like to raise around, which is also captured in the laundry list, is because SIOP adds a layer of indirection between the relying parties and the claims providers, the relationship becomes more abstract. There's a layer of indirection between who asserted some claims about a user and who's relying upon them. And SIOP also offers the opportunity, because it alleviates things like NASCAR, for OpenID to move into richer identity information sharing from multiple origins that relying parties then rely on. And there's a cohort around neighboring communities that are using alternative assertion formats, such as verifiable credentials and linked data proofs. And these offer what I would call richer assertions. They carry more information with them about the claims being presented, and they could definitely help to potentially facilitate the necessity for the relying party to completely understand the claims that they are relying upon. So I'm proposing that if we were to revise the aggregated and distributed claims to allow alternative formats as an opt-in, then OpenID providers could provide this assertion format as an alternative. The way this would look in an aggregated and distributed claim response would be that a relying party can convey the claim sources they support in the request. So they would say, if this member was omitted from the request, then JWT is assumed by default. However, if they do communicate in the request that they also support other formats, such as a JSON-LD-based verifiable credential, then the SIOP can elect if they have supporting proofs. And to answer George's question, yes, there is. And the outstanding question that I have is, would that simply be a JWT-based VC? Because the data model and the usage of JWT is quite different to, say, the ID token. I.e., all the claims are not in the root of the JSON object. Instead, they are nested under a claim member called VC.
I guess I never assumed that JWT meant it had to have all the claims in the root level.
So the
or that it had to look like an ID token.
Okay, yeah.
It has to look like a VC. So the JWT is just embedded in the VC, and every claim that's in a JWT has to be converted to a VC. So you don't process the claims in the JWT, you process them in a VC, which is a problem, potential problem.
Tony, you're saying that's what the JWT form of a verifiable credential is?
Yes. So if there's a claim within a JWT, you change that to a VC. So
so you're saying, Tony, to clarify, the key here would be VC?
Yes, so it's a VC that has a JWT in it, and the spec says that you convert JWT claims to VC claims.
Which is essentially,
okay,
yeah.
That wasn't what I was suggesting. I was suggesting I thought verifiable credentials, and I obviously don't know the answer, but I thought that there was a way that you could there was a way to use JWT signing of verifiable credentials.
There is.
As opposed to having to use the partial, all of the basically canonicalization that's required in JSON LD signatures.
There is. You can use JWT proofs, which is the signing.
Right.
Okay.
It's also important to keep distinct that claims in an OpenID context, usually people believe that means user information, whereas all of the keys in JWTs are called claims: the issuer, the not before, expiry, etc. So I assume that people are meaning just the user information and not the cryptographic properties have to be in JSON-LD format.
Correct.
Yes, that's so. Essentially, at the moment, aggregated and distributed claims allows for multiple claim sources for the same source, multiple assertions of the same source, but JWT has to be present. A JWT form of those claims have to be present. And this proposal would be to essentially assume it by default, but allow a relying party on request to a provider to say that I actually support alternative forms of claims on an opt-in basis. And therefore the provider, if they supported it and wanted to render those claims in an alternative format, could do so and wouldn't be forced to also sign them in a JWT form.
Is signing a verifiable credential in a JWT format a significant implication for an issuer?
It's just essentially it would be a double signing scenario, and you would then have I'm not sure why you would have multiple of the exact same assertion with the exact same claims in it returned, describing the user just in two different assertion formats.
Okay, I need to obviously do some research because I don't think my questions are clear, or else I'm totally missing something. So I'll be quiet. We can keep going.
Okay, and lastly, I'd like to raise a proposal around what I'm calling as a device flow style interaction, which is a flow similar to OAuth2 device flow, which is essentially sometimes the SIOP and relying party are not on the same device, and hence a redirect flow back from the SIOP back to the relying party's website is not possible. And an example of this is kind of a site request sent over a QR code or NFC or some form of transport mechanism that communicates that request. And the flow would be that the SIOP response would be sent back to a backchannel endpoint via, say, an HTTP post that the browser is capable of picking up through a polling mechanism or to make it like device flow or some other mechanism. The SIOP then basically stays in this state. Just all it knows is that it sent the response, and the authenticated session is started on the device, or is completed on the device after receipt of the SIOP response. A way we could potentially do this is adding a new response mode, which is an HTTP post, which is essentially indicating to the receipt of the request that they will not be redirected as a product of the flow. Instead, they will just be sending the response. And some of the unanswered questions around here, I believe multiple people have identified this before, is how we do anti-spoofing mechanisms. A user could be fooled into authorizing a web session on the device if they don't control it, if there aren't suitable guarantees around how long the request is valid for, and potentially challenging the user for the resulting authenticated web session. Also, how does adding a new response mode impact on existing flows? And browsers need some way to receive the response, e.g. similar to how polling an endpoint like a client does in OAuth device flow. And with that, those are the main questions I have in regards to the SIOP laundry list. The laundry list is available on this link, and questions and comments would be great to direct in that direction.
Thanks, Tobias. That was a great summary of the problem statements. Is there any questions or comments?
No,
So
I thought
Tony,
it was good, so I appreciate it. It was a good summary, Tobias. Thanks.
completely agree. And Tony, I thought you were working on the ZKP.
Yep, working on that's with JW, that's with JOTs themselves. So not on any of the LD proofs or anything else like that. So it's just taking a JWK and applying ZKP to it. And there are different algorithms. So I haven't figured a way out to standardize a single way, but there are ways to do things like uprove and in the IBM one. So there are ways to do both of those that I've tested.
So what you're working on would probably go along with what Tobias explained.
Yes, yes, exactly. In a different, I think we could combine them, yes.
Yeah, just on that as well, we've been doing some work in and around a signature format that supports selective disclosure and those anti-correlation mechanisms that zero-knowledge proofs offer. And there's a link there to our open source contributions and around the spec. The way we've drawn the boundaries is at one layer you have the cryptography, the new supported crypto primitives, and then the next question is how do you represent that? And we have, to date, represented that in a linked data proof, but there's nothing preventing that from also being represented in a JWT.
Yeah, and the other part is stuff that's going on in the IETF as far as the privacy pass, or I think it was called something else to begin with, trust tokens, is also applicable here.
Yes, trust tokens are the W3 effort to apply them to HTTP.
Yes, and so the privacy pass is in the IETF part. So there's two parts to that. Crypto stuff is in IETF, and the HTTP part's over in W3C.
Thanks, Tobias. All right, so if there is no other questions or comments, maybe we can go to Tom.